I'm Barbara Mead. I'm one of the founders of Politics and Prose. Thank you. Thank you. And one of the things we've been doing at Politics and Prose since the earliest days, 32 years ago, is introducing Michael Kazin, because Michael has been here for every one of his books. I feel very honored to know that he has always been faithful to us to come and tell our audience about his books. So he's come today to talk about his new book, War Against War. The New York Times has already reviewed this as a timely reminder of how easily the will of the majority can be thwarted in even the mightiest of democracies. I want to say that it's totally coincidental, the timing of this event. When it was scheduled, the Women's March on Washington was not on the calendar at all. But I look upon it as just completely fortuitous of the timing of their being back to back with each other. And I look upon it as fortuitous also to be able to quote this review, which indicates really of how timely a book about World War I is still today. And Michael will certainly talk about that more in his talk. Michael's a professor of American history at Georgetown University, but he also wrote a large part of this book while working on a fellowship from the Advanced Research Collaborative at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Before Georgetown University, he was a professor of history at American University. He's also taught at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, and he has been invited to speak in many places around the world to lecture at academic institutions. In his younger years, Michael was very much a political activist. When he was an undergraduate at Harvard, he was a chair of the Students for a Democratic Society. Once that his younger years were over, he had shifted gears a little bit and started writing books. Now 6 in all. This is his 6th. His last book, American Dreamers, about how the left changed America, was named a Best Book of the Year by Newsweek and the New Republic. And 2 other books, A Godly Hero about William Jennings Bryan and America Divided about the Civil Wars of the 60s, were also named Books of the Year by several newspapers. Besides writing books, Michael is also a regular contributor in the media world. You can read him quite regularly in your monthly, weekly journals. He writes in the Washington Post, the New York Times, The Nation, Politico, Foreign Affairs, and the New Republic, where he is featured as an online columnist. But most of you here know Michael as the co-editor, along with Michael Walzer, of Dissent, the magazine of the American left, founded by Irving Howe in 1954. And Michael dedicates his new book to all his fellow dissentniks. Michael's life has been filled with academic honors, including fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Fulbright, and many, many more. So I also feel, as I said at the beginning, it is a great honor for Michael to be here this evening and to be able to introduce him and to be able to sit here so close to him and hear all his wisdom. So here is Michael to tell us about his new book. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks to friends and people who are not yet friends for coming. I want to start by thanking Barbara and Politics and Prose in general for being the best bookstore in D.C. and perhaps the whole country. As Barbara said, I've had a coming out party for my books for the past 30 years when it was a little hole in the wall on the other side of the street. And I can't imagine literary life in the city without it. I regret that neither Carla Cohen nor David Cohen is still around to be here and to talk to you about my work and their work. They introduced me to DC over 50 years ago when I was a summer intern for David at America for Democratic Action downtown. I did the ADA voting record, if people remember what that was. And I'd love to know what Carla and David think about what's going on in America today. But let me tell you what was going on in America 100 years ago and what relevance it might have for the present. Exactly 100 years ago this afternoon, the President of the United States stood in front of a audience of the Senate and a packed gallery to give a rather remarkable speech. And I'm just going to, have not committed that speech to memory, so let me quote you a couple of the lines. World War I had begun in August 1914, as most of you know, and had been going on for more than 2.5 years by this time, about 2.5 years by this point. Over 10 million people had died. Much of Europe, in fact, much of the world was involved and torn asunder. Wilson said, "This present war must first be ended, but it makes a great deal of difference in what way and upon what terms it is ended." He said, "We need a peace that will win the approval of mankind, sealed by a universal covenant of cooperative peace." He went on to say that what we need is a peace without victory. Think of that, a peace without victory. He said, "Victory for one side would leave a sting, a resentment, a bitter memory upon which terms of peace would rest, not permanently, but only as upon quicksand. Only a peace between equals can last," said the President of the United States. Well, not surprisingly, many a Republican senator mocked what Wilson said. One said that Wilson would make Don Quixote jealous. Another said, "The president thinks he's president of the whole world." But many more Americans probably agreed with Wilson. This is before public opinion polls, so of course we don't know how many did, how many didn't. But it was very clear that there was a large group of people in Congress and outside Congress who agreed with what Wilson was saying, who wanted the U.S. to stay out of World War I. And a big reason why they felt that way, I think, is that the largest and most diverse peace coalition in U.S. history had been agitating and educating them since the war began in the summer of 1914 to view the war in Europe as a complete disaster, a disaster which their nation had no reason or interest to fight. So in this book, I try to tell the story of a coalition, really larger than a movement, a real coalition of different forces, which was created at the beginning of the war in Europe in August 1914, and did what it could to stop the U.S. from first preparing to fight in that war by enlarging in a major way the armed forces, especially the Army, which was quite small at the beginning of the war. And then, of course, tried and failed to stop the United States from entering what at the time was by far the most destructive war in human history, as it was called the Great War, and it's still called that in much of Europe. And then in the book, I go on to talk about how this movement went on to endure an unprecedented onslaught of government repression, which followed when Woodrow Wilson changed his mind and decided it was necessary for the United States to enter the war in order to bring about a just peace, though no longer a peace between equals. He stopped using that phrase. But of course, once you decide to go to war and you want to win the war, the peace which will result is not going to be a peace between equals. So of course, there would be no peace without victory, no peace between equals, and the war is still seen today, I think, both by historians in this country, most of them, and many historians around the world, as a serious mistake. Not just a mistake at the time, but a mistake which helped to lay the groundwork for the second and even greater World War, World War II, and arguably for the Cold War as well. I make a few gestures that one of the things historians are not supposed to do in the book, which is counterfactual history, wondering what would have happened if Wilson had lost the election in 1916, when his slogan was, "He kept us out of war," wondering what would have happened if the United States had not declared war, how the war would have ended. One can't really know the answers to those questions, but it's certainly conceivable that if the U.S. had not fought in the war, that the Germans would not have lost the war, and then, again, counterfactually, Adolf Hitler would never have become a world-famous individual. He would just have been a corporal in that war who got injured and then was quickly forgotten. Well, obviously history does not repeat itself. All historians know that. I thought that I could talk a lot more about World War I, a lot more about the details of the war, how the U.S. got into it, and what the anti-war movement did. But I want to do it in the context of what a lot of us are probably thinking about. What happened yesterday, what might happen in the next 4 years of the presidency of Donald J. Trump, whether or not you voted for Donald J. Trump, I'm sure most of you did, or did not vote for him. These questions about how one puts together an opposition coalition to oppose those in power in Washington and oppose what they want to do is an evergreen question, I think. And so I want to talk about my book and talk about the coalition 100 years ago in that context. First of all, the coalition, which I write about, the war against war, was as ideologically broad a coalition as any opposition to anything in U.S. history. It included quite remarkable partnership. For example, the majority leader of the House was a guy named Claude Kitchin from the 2nd District of North Carolina. How many people ever heard of Claude Kitchin? Yeah, a few historians. So. And historically minded journalists like Jane back there. He was a Jim Crow supporter. In fact, he was part of a movement, was Kitchin, which drove black people from the polls in North Carolina in 1898, an infamous movement which culminated in what was called the Wilmington Riot, a white riot. In fact, he was elected replacing the only black congressman who was in Congress at the time, a guy named George White. It included one of the most racist and pro-lynching senators in America at the time, a guy named James Vardaman from Mississippi. But it also included almost everyone on the left of American politics. The editor of the Masses magazine, Max Eastman, his sister, Crystal Eastman, who was an amazing organizer of peace groups and feminist groups and suffrage groups. It included Emma Goldman, the famous anarchist. It included A. Philip Randolph, young man at the time, a socialist, became, of course, the leader of the Union of Sleeping Car Porters, and then the godfather, if you will, of the March on Washington in 1963. So, I mean, think of a movement today, which would include, the most racist senator in the Senate and a black socialist. It was also geographically diverse. The centers of the opposition were in New York City, not surprisingly perhaps, but also in rural Wisconsin, in the Dakotas, and the Deep South, where people like Vardaman and Kitchin came from. Among the 50 congresspeople who voted against declaring war in early April 1917 were Kitchin, the majority leader of the House of Representatives, the only socialist in Congress, a guy named Meyer London, who was a Russian Jewish immigrant and a labor lawyer from New York City, the only prohibitionist in the House of Representatives, which it may surprise you to know where he was from, Los Angeles. It used to be known as the city of churches. And the first woman, and the only woman at the time elected to the House of Representatives, a woman named Jeanette Rankin, a Republican from Missoula, Montana. Like every opposition in history that's become large and influential, this movement had an inside-outside strategy. And this is one of the things we're thinking about the opposition to the Trump administration today. On the outside, it mounted street marches, parades in many cities all across the country. In fact, the first anti-war march in August 1914 was a women's march. Yes, down Fifth Avenue in New York. About 1,500 women marched from different countries, but tens of thousands of people were watching from the sides. Unlike yesterday's march, men were not allowed to march. Luckily, we were yesterday. They started new organizations, like the Women's Peace Party, which it was founded in February 1915 downtown at the Willard Hotel with 3,000 women, all the most sort of prominent women reformers in America, Jane Addams, heads of the women's suffrage movement, socialists, went to that meeting. Later on, there's a group called the American Union Against Militarism, which was formed to lobby Congress and also to put on various events outside. Once the draft was instituted, soon after war was declared, there were various anti-draft groups. One called the No Conscription League was led by a guy named Norman Thomas, a young Presbyterian minister who later on became the most famous socialist in America. And they, of course, had lots of mass meetings with people like William Jennings Bryan after he resigned as Secretary of State because he opposed what he thought was a slide towards war, spoke to, and many other famous figures spoke as well. And they had a lot of creative tactics. For example, they put on in New York City in 1916 what they called a war against war exhibit, which is one of the places I get my title from, which made fun of militarism. It was a witty, satirical attack on militarism, on those who wanted to build up the military, and of course on war in general. They had a display at the War Against War exhibit of a life-size papier-mâché model of a stegosaurus, which symbolized the peril of having all armor plate and no brains. And an astonishing total of 5,000 to 10,000 New Yorkers came to see this every day for months, first in Brooklyn and then in Manhattan. And then it traveled around the country. And being creative activists that they were, the American Union Against Militarism, which put this on, put together a set of posters for $8 that you could buy and show in your institution, your church or your YWCA or Union Hall. Pictures of the kind of things that you could have seen if you were there in person for the exhibit. But this was, as I said, not just a protest movement from outside, not just a movement which went into the streets. It had very close and reliable allies in Congress, especially Southern Democrats like Kitchen and Midwest Republicans like the great progressive Republican senator from Wisconsin, Robert La Follette, and several others. They all agreed that building up the armed forces and then going to war would shift more power to big industrial corporations and to investment houses on Wall Street. They thought the only people going to gain from the war were those who were actually making money from selling things to the Allies. And they also had support from a rather unusual coalition figure, you might say, Henry Ford, the most famous businessman in America, maybe in the world. Excuse me, Henry Ford was a dedicated pacifist at the time. In 1915, Henry Ford chartered a ship, a Norwegian ship. Norway was a neutral nation at the time, called the Oscar II, and brought over several hundred anti-war activists, plus a whole coterie of people from the press, to Europe, where he said he was going to bring the boys out of the trenches by Christmas. This was even more of a tremendous promise than Wilson had made, would make a year or so later. Of course, he didn't do that, but the idea was to have neutral Americans meet with neutral Norwegians and Swiss and Dutch, and somehow, he wasn't quite clear about how, lobby the belligerent nations to come up with a peace plan. And there are other somewhat less brash attempts to do that as well, which Jane Addams was very much involved in. Now, I should say right away that the term isolationist is often used about the people who opposed World War I. I think it's an inaccurate term for the most part. Most of the people I've talked about, like all the people I've talked about, were very clear. They were not opposed to the United States being engaged in the world, in helping solve the problems of people in the world, of helping to bring about peace out of war. What they wanted was the U.S. to be engaged in doing so peacefully. They wanted to foster democratic governance. They wanted to foster the peaceful resolution of disputes. They believed military might would only make things worse. So they were, you can call them naive, you can call them messianic, you can call them much too idealistic, but you can't call them isolationists, because just as much as Wilson, they wanted to help make a more democratic, peaceful world. Now, what kind of success did they have? Well, I think this combination of inside-outside power was successful for a time in stopping preparedness. Preparedness was, as some of you know, a movement led by people, very popular figures like Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, Elihu Root, and a well-financed group with a lot of members called the National Security League, which wanted to build up the American army to the size of the armies in Europe that were fighting the war, and wanted to build the Navy up to be the rival of the British Navy as well. And the advocates of peace argued that you prepare for war and you make war more likely. And they think that's what had happened with Europe, that all the European powers, European empires, had thought the other side was preparing, so they better prepare as well, and they ended up having the military might to fight each other to the death, to many, many millions of deaths. And also I think, and this is a complicated story, and not time to go into it in detail, but the Peace Coalition had as I suggested before, in sort of a complicated relationship with Woodrow Wilson, with the president. Probably different from the relationship people who marched yesterday will have with Donald Trump, but never know. Change is always possible. They went to the White House a lot, socialists and pacifists, and as well, of course, of people like Claude Kitchen, the majority leader, went to the White House sometimes together to urge Wilson to hold off, to not support enlarging the army, and then, of course, to hold off from declaring war calling on Congress to declare war. And Wilson sometimes was very friendly, sometimes less friendly, went back and forth, but he kept meeting with them, and he kept encouraging them. So up until just a couple months before war was declared, many people in the Peace Coalition thought, well, Wilson does want to enlarge the military a little bit, but his heart's not really in it. He's really on our side. And the one time when they really thought he was on their side, or at least they should be on his side, was the election of 1916, which was an interesting election, which, political junkies, I can certainly answer questions and talk much more about. But this was an unusual election because almost everybody on the left supported Woodrow Wilson for president. And if they hadn't, he probably would have lost the election. Eugene Debs, the famous socialist who'd run for president 4 times in a row, before 1916 decided he wasn't going to run for various reasons. But the man who did run on the Socialist Party ticket was much less well known than Debs was, and he got many fewer votes, and he got many fewer votes in the key states, which are very close, between Charles Evans Hughes, the Republican candidate, who was backed very strongly by pro-war figures like Theodore Roosevelt, and states like California and Ohio. And in California, which was the state which made the difference in the Electoral College, I say political junkies, of which I am one, of course, but this is important. Wilson won the state by 3,887 votes. And of course, you don't have to be a mathematician to say if half plus one of those votes had shifted over to Hughes instead of Wilson, Hughes would have won the electoral vote, but not the popular vote. That never happens, right? And Wilson won the election very, very narrowly. And it seemed like, now Wilson was going to help to make peace, was going to be a mediator, he hoped. And he gave the Peace Without Victory speech as part of that effort. And of course, the Peace Coalition supported him all the way along at that point. But then 10 days after Wilson gives this Peace Without Victory speech, the Don Quixote of the White House, so to speak, the Imperial German military, Navy, resumes unrestricted U-boat warfare, which they had, since the Lusitania had been torpedoed in early 1915, which most people probably heard about. They had, in effect, made an agreement with Wilson that would not torpedo neutral ships. If they did come on a neutral ship they thought had munitions, they would surface and make sure to take the civilians off the ship before they sank the ship. But in part because the Germans believed, the German military at least, believed the United States would eventually get into the war, and they thought if the U.S. did get into the war, they wouldn't be able to defeat this huge behemoth with all these fresh troops. They decided to resume unrestricted U-boat warfare. And that began on February 2nd, 1917, just 10 days after Wilson gives his gloriously pro-peace, Peace Without Victory speech. So after that, things happened very quickly. And the U.S. declares war April 6th, 1917. And what happens, most you know, is Wilson goes from being an intermittent friend to the Peace Coalition to being its avowed enemy. With his support, Congress passes some of the most repressive laws in American history, the Espionage Act in 1917 and the Sedition Act, which are actually amendments to the Espionage Act in 1918, which, not to put too fine a point on it, basically, if you speak out against the war or against the draft, or even by 1918, speak out against the president, you could be put in jail as a felony, not just a little misdemeanor. And I have various details about people who, in the book, people who spoke out against the war and even in the privacy of their own homes, and someone heard them and they were reported and they went to jail for a couple of years at least. In the 19 months before the armistice, before the Germans were defeated, November 1918, what remained of the peace forces quickly moved to defend themselves with the help of a new organization called the National Civil Liberties Bureau, headed by anti-war radicals like Crystal Eastman and Roger Baldwin, who was a disciple of Emma Goldman's. In 1920, that organization got renamed the American Civil Liberties Union. Well, I think I've just about come up to the half-an-hour mark here. So let me mention a few possible lessons for protest movements today. I've been involved in protest movements, as Barbara suggested, for, I don't know, more than 50 years. And I teach about them. You know, it's nice when what you've done for free, you get paid for. Not organizing, but talking about and studying these things. So 3 possible lessons. And again, I put these out with a little trepidation because many people here are activists. Many people have thought about these issues in the present, probably more deeply than I have. But 3 things I think one might learn from the success, to the degree there was influence, at least, that the anti-war movement had 100 years ago. First of all, you have to focus, I think, on the urgent needs of the movement, stop the Army from getting stronger in their case, perhaps stop ACA from getting repealed or replaced. But you can't stop talking about the vision you have of the way society and the world should work. People are motivated to do political activism by fear, but also by hope. And you have to motivate them in both ways. And that's what the anti-war movement did 100 years ago. They were afraid of getting the U.S. into this terrible war in Europe, which had already killed 10 to 12 million people by 1917. However, they also talked about a different world that they wanted to build. And if they hadn't talked about that different world, they wouldn't have been able to put together the vast coalition they had. They wouldn't be able to keep themselves going after they were being put into jail for just speaking out against the war and the draft. Second, it's important, I think, to find ways for people to be involved in their daily lives, where they live, where they work, where they drink. You know, you can't ask people to come to Washington, you know, every couple months and go on a march, right? People have to be involved in their institutions. The anti-war coalition was involved in churches, it was involved in labor unions, it was involved in its own organizations, various ways it was involved. And it became a mass movement because of that. And of course, people just lobbied the congressman, just wrote letters to the congressman. Parenthetically, one of the things I love to do in historical research is read letters from voters to politicians. I did a lot of it when I wrote my book about William James Bryan. I did a bunch of it in this book as well. It's just fascinating to see, you know, what kind of concerns people had about the war at the time. One of the ways in which the anti-war coalition tried to stop the war after the Germans had unrestricted U-boat warfare, had resumed unrestricted U-boat warfare in February 1917, was they said, let's have a referendum. Let's have the people vote. And several congressmen, in fact, had held votes in their home districts, which, not surprisingly, because they wanted to hold the referendum, found that 9-1 or 10-1 margins opposed the U.S. declaring war. But this was a way you could take part. You could pass around, you know, a clipboard. I'm not sure they had clipboards in 1917. But anyway, piece of paper, they had that. And they wanted, of course, Congress to and the president to authorize a national referendum, which would have been held through the post offices around the country. You'd go to your post office and you'd fill out a little form saying, yes, go to war, don't go to war. This was a very smart thing to do. Referendums were popular around the country anyway. This is the progressive era. People liked sort of the idea that they could vote down a law that the legislature had passed or through the initiative process, put a law on, create a law and make it a law of the state. So this was a very popular thing to do, and of course it didn't succeed, but it galvanized a lot of people at the time. And finally, and this might be controversial, I think it's a mistake to write off any portion of your fellow citizens. Well, maybe Richard Spencer, but you know, those who backed preparedness, those who then supported the war, which was a majority of Americans by the time war was declared, clearly had as much reason to oppose preparedness, I think, has as much reason to oppose going to war as peace activists did. So I sincerely believe that if you want to build a majority movement, which can not just stop something bad from happening, but change the country, you can't say, you know, someone's deplorable. You know. And if all else fails, and I'll end here, and you lose, you can often taste redemption in the future. By the early 1920s, most Americans thought it had been a mistake to fight in World War I. The Senate, as you probably know, voted down the peace treaty that was signed by Woodrow Wilson in Paris. And historians by the 1930s were writing revisionist histories of World War I, where I won't go into detail, but they found various reasons to argue that this was a terrible war. Americans didn't know what they were getting into, and America never should have been involved in it. And this didn't change until World War II. And it was only in the first couple decades of the Cold War that historians began to say, World War I wasn't so bad. Wilson probably had the right idea. And since Vietnam, it's going back the other way again. One of the things I was interested to find out, I wrote a piece about this in the Daily Beast last week. Most historians, both on the left and the right today, if you read them about World War or about American history, they don't agree about anything, except World War I. They both think entering World War I was a bad idea. They both think Wilson was a very bad president by entering World War I. This is, basically, but I just want to end with a couple words from the man who I actually did get the title of this book from, a guy named William James, great philosopher and psychologist who wrote a great essay in 1910, the year he died, called The Moral Equivalent of War. The Moral Equivalent of War, where he was trying to figure out how you could find an equivalent to war which would inspire people as much, which would call on, especially young men, call on their spirit of sacrifice and service as much as war does. His answers weren't very good. They're basically a form of national service, which didn't convince very many people. But he did, whoops, here. He was very realistic, as a good pragmatist should be. He wrote this in 1910. He said, "Pure loot and mastery seem no longer morally allowable motives for war. No legitimate interest of any nation would seem to justify the tremendous destructions which a war to compass it would necessarily entail. Common sense and reason ought to find a way to reach agreement in every conflict of honest interests." He said, at the end of that essay, he said, "History is a bath of blood." And I think only by recognizing that fact and finding alternatives to war, we'll be able to change that sentence, that reality. And I wish us well. Thank you.
We've got one over here and one over here. If people with questions will go to the mic, please.
I'm saluting an old friend, so I'm not actually in the military.
Pull it out. That's right. Good.
Yeah, I noticed you talked about the preparedness. There also was a strong 100% Americanism movement and an attack on hybrid, on hyphenated Americans.
Right.
Did the anti-war movement deal with that movement?
Oh, yes. Well, of course, the melting pot idea was popularized by Theodore Roosevelt, who was very much in favor of going to war. He wanted to go to war almost as soon as war started in 1914, and certainly after Lusitania was torpedoed. He wanted to go to war. This was a movement, I didn't say enough about this, which was, of course, as America was at the time, multicultural, multi-ethnic. It was very strong among Irish Americans who didn't like going to war to support England. It was very strong among German Americans, not surprisingly, which was more problematic. and very strong among Russian Jewish immigrants, especially, many of whom were left, and until the February Revolution in Russia in 1917, they were completely opposed to going to war to support the Tsar. So the anti-war coalition, didn't spend a lot of time rebutting 100% Americanism. There were figures like, got him, blocking his name at the moment. The great liberal intellectual who wrote for the Republic. Thank you, Randolph Bourne. Sorry. Yeah. Been a long day. Randolph Bourne, who wrote books about, essays, not books, he didn't live long enough to write books, about how America should be, in effect, transnational, should be much more open to different cultures. But he was a fairly unimportant figure. Became more important actually after he died, when people like Christopher Lasch, other historians, began to look back at the war and that period, and found how eloquent he'd been and prophetic in many ways he'd been. So, in effect, they opposed 100% Americanism, but they didn't spend a lot of time focusing on it. Hi, sorry.
Could you talk some more about how these ardent and violent segregationists at the time were willing to support this essentially anti-war position? Because certainly now you have a real connection between militarism and racism.
Yeah. Well, it was complicated. Kitchen, I think, was a serious Christian. He believed that at least after he helped drive black people away from the polls, that the Christ's message was a message of peace. And also, remember, this is a time when most people on Wall Street were Republicans, and there was this tremendous populist, small p, resentment in much of the South against Northeastern Capital, which was Republican. And so they really, and this was as I said, agreement they had with socialists and anarchists, that they thought only reason why Americans might go to war is because big business, headquartered in New York and Boston, Chicago and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, will push America towards war, that the ordinary American doesn't want to go to war. So that was their points of agreement, I guess you should say. And they also opposed the draft because they thought the draft was going to build a big central militaristic state, and they were opposed to it. There's a fascinating quote by William Stone, who was a senator from Missouri, which was kind of a southern state back then, certainly segregated. And he was one of the 6 senators who voted against the war. He was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he voted against the war, which was being pushed by his own president at the time. And Stone said, "If we go into this war, we will never again have the same old republic." And segregationists believe the same thing. I mean, this was states' rights is a little too simple the way to put it, but they believe that the war would bring on a much larger central government, which could do things like do away with segregation, which would do things like put guns in the hands of black people. Vardaman was opposed to the draft because he said, I don't want black people in Mississippi to have guns, At least they had guns, but I don't want them to have uniforms and guns and have the right to shoot them, So that was it, I think. History's complicated. Yeah.
Thank you. First
Thank
of
you.
all, what was the role at the time of the armaments manufacturers? Because when I think about fast forward 100 years, how very large and dominant the companies are that are part of, that are involved with the military.
No, that's a good question. Yeah. There weren't armaments companies as such at the time. I mean, there were, steel companies. I mean, it's interesting. The man who had been by far the biggest steel magnate in the world, Andrew Carnegie, he retired in 1901, but he was very much in favor of peace up until 1914, and then he was destroyed because he couldn't believe that the war was going on. But certainly his company began to make armor plate, and had been making armor plate for American battleships before, and began to make many more of them. A lot of armaments manufacturers started making rifles, not just for Americans, but for the British and the French as well. In fact, I think it's some military historian here might be able to correct me. I'm not a military historian, but I think by 1916, the majority of rifles that the British and the French carried into battle on the Western Front were American-made. So, and perhaps most importantly, J.P. Morgan and Company became sort of the commission agent for the British. They got 1% of everything the British bought in the United States, and there were German-American investment houses as well, Kuhn-Loeb and some others, but they obviously were not going to get involved in that trade, and they were less important in the end. So, but it's a great question. We really didn't have a massive armaments industry like we do now. But the size of the American army when 1914 was about 100,000. People said it was about the same size as the army of Romania. And by the time U.S. Was able to send troops over to Europe in large numbers, there were 2 million Americans going to Europe by 1918, and another 2 million more were in training. So it's one of the reasons the Germans gave up, a big reason, because they could not continue to clearly, they were 14, 15-year-olds were being drafted and sent into battle by the Germans by that point. And 2 million fresh American troops, gung-ho to fight, was more than the Germans could withstand. Yes.
Go ahead, you're on.
Well, to what extent, speaking of Donald Trump and his inaugural address, to what extent did the America First movement, the anti-war movement in the late 30s and early 40s, apart from people who were sympathetic to Nazi Germany and anti-Semitic, et cetera, to what extent did that draw on the lessons of World War I? And
that's a great question. It's a great question.
Draw wisely or not?
We've heard of Charles Lindbergh, I think.
Yeah.
One of the leaders of it, who got in a little trouble, saying that basically American Jews wanted the U.S. to get into war. The ones pushing the U.S. to get into war. But Charles Lindbergh's father was a Swedish immigrant, congressman from Minnesota. He did not vote against the war, but he spoke against it before it happened, and that was part of of Charles's legacy, certainly. I don't know actually if he talked to his father about it, but and a lot of the arguments they made were arguments that were made, in 1915, 1916 by the anti-war movement too. I think the arguments made some sense in 1915, 1916. I don't think they made any sense in 1939, 1940, but that's a different matter. But of course, it's not just generals who fight the last war. Sometimes anti-generals fight the last war as well, and there was a pretty broad coalition as well. America First, 800,000 members, including people like Gerald Ford, Gore Vidal, Norman Thomas, and some very conservative business people as well. So it was a very broad coalition, but of course Lindbergh's ill-advised comments in I think it was June or July 1941 helped to destroy it, and in the end most Americans, of course, Pearl Harbor, it went out of business entirely. But no, they saw themselves to some degree as part of the legacy of the anti-war movement, World War I.
I wonder if you could elaborate a little more on the German-American sort of position on things and just things revolving around German Americans, especially in eastern cities.
Yeah.
I ask that because I remember my father, who was 14 in World War I, was forbidden by his father from joining the Boy Scouts because his father felt that there was some sort of connection between these uniformed kids and the military. And so you mentioned that it was kind of a tricky thing for German Americans to deal with the issue then. Can you elaborate at all
Sure.
on that?
Well, this is a time, as some of you know, some historians in the crowd know, when German Americans were, if not the largest, certainly one of the 2 or 3 largest immigrant groups in the country. They were powerful. They were so powerful in some parts of the country that they had public schools where you could go to school in public schools in Germany,
Right.
like in Texas. Luckenbach, Texas, made famous by Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson. Anyway, I digress. And this German-American Alliance had 2 million members, which was financed by the Brewers'
Right.
interests primarily. And it pushed very hard in 1914, early 1915, to keep the U.S. neutral, not to trade with any belligerent nation, because they knew, obviously, if the U.S. was going to trade with any nation, it was going to be trading with the British and the French. And as I'm sure you know, the Germans had tried to counter the fact they were using U-boats to try to counter the fact that the British had mined the North Sea, so it was very difficult to get, almost impossible to get goods across the ocean anyway, even if American shippers had wanted to do so. But Lusitania, I think, pretty much ended their possibility of getting very far. Even though most Americans, I don't think, after the Lusitania was torpedoed in May 1915, wanted to get into the war. And newspaper editorials show that, I think. And Wilson himself, very clear, he didn't think Americans wanted to get into the war at this point. By then, at that point, the idea that most Americans who were not German Americans or Austrians was going to side with the Germans or think it didn't matter, that either side won or it wouldn't be a good thing, that was unlikely. It doesn't mean Americans wanted to get into the war, but at the same time, it also meant that I think if you held a poll, who do you blame more for the war? They would have blamed the Germans more for the war because of the Lusitania. They didn't think about, and there wasn't as much attention given in newspapers to the mining of the North Sea, to German civilians dying in large numbers of hunger, especially young people and babies and older people. So that was part of it. And really, German-American culture never quite recovered, I think, from World War I. People hear about the stuff, they renamed sauerkraut, Liberty Cabbage, and this kind of thing. But that was fairly small. What was really important is that all these very, as you know, very elaborate network of German-American institutions, gymnastic clubs and singing clubs, and of course the Germans were a very important part of all the parties. But the Socialist Party was really took its lead from the German Socialist Party at that time, and that all didn't get destroyed, but it went underground at best, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great.
Hi, Matt.
Hi. Thanks. That was really great. Curious why. So why do you think ultimately that the war against war failed? Why was it something internal to the anti-war movement? You described the divisions and also just how broad the coalition was, but was that also a weakness and a strength? And then also counterfactually, was there anything that the anti-war movement might have done differently that could have made a difference and prevented Wilson from going to war?
He's a good historian here. Matt Dallek, read his book on civil defense during World War II, by the way. Excellent book.
Thank you.
Over in the history section. So. Sure. You can pay me afterwards.
I got it.
Well, I think I used the juxtaposition of the speech that Wilson gave 100 years ago, and then 10 days later, Germans starting to torpedo neutral ships again without mercy. Once that happened, Wilson and the Germans had signed what they called the Sussex Pledge in 1916. Actually, it wasn't. I simplified a little bit. It wasn't right after Lusitania, but it was 1916, and he felt they had gone back on that. And also, I think once he had gone out there with speeches like the Peace Without Victory speech and said, "I want to help to, stop this war and solve the war in a good way," once the Germans made it very clear that they weren't going to let the U.S. do that. Then he thought, okay, well, I'll just have to do it by supporting the Allies. I think Wilson all along, it's very clear from his papers, he didn't want the U.S. to get into the war, I think, really until February of 1917, but he certainly didn't want the Germans to win either. So as long as, now you could argue perhaps counterfactually that the anti-war coalition should have stayed more independent from Wilson. They should have supported the socialist candidate in 1916. Or just stayed out of electoral politics altogether. But, as I said, I don't think that's a good thing for movements to do anyway. And I think, if the President of the United States, who has the power, after all, to go to Congress and ask Congress to declare war, when Congress still declared war, says he's on your side, then you want to give him the benefit of the doubt as long as you can. Because they knew Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge running American foreign policy would not be on their side. They knew they wanted to go to war, and they wanted to draft, which the anti-war people didn't want. So, I can talk about the counterfactual of what would have happened if Hughes had won. I think there might have been a lot more Democrats who voted against the declaration of war, actually, and there would have been maybe large demonstrations in Washington, and they were just very tiny ones. But I think once the Germans made that decision, and there was, by the way, I don't want to get into the fine weeds of the history of the war itself, but there was a huge argument, actually, between the civilian leaders in Germany, including the Chancellor at the time, and the military leaders. Civilian leaders said, this is going to bring the U.S. into the war, and we're going to lose if that happens. The military leaders said, don't worry, we'll sink enough ships, the British will surrender by then, before the U.S. troops get over there. And of course, guess who was right? And by the way, the German ambassador to the United States, a guy named Johann von Bernstorff, Bernstorff, sorry for my German, had an American wife, and he was always opposed to doing anything that would get the U.S. into the war, because he knew that that would be the end if that happened.
Michael, I'm not going to try to climb over.
Hi, Leo.
Hi. So I use my teacher's voice. I'm wondering.
Leo Casey, a great union activist, official with the American Federation of Teachers, and on the editorial board of Dissent magazine.
I'm wondering if you might want to talk a little about the intersection of anti-imperialist movement, anti-war movement, given that there's big battles for Irish independence, big battles for Indian independence,
Yeah.
and all sorts of stuff going on in Europe with the Germans trying to support the Irish.
No, that's a great question. No, I mean, clearly one of the segments, the more left-wing segments of the anti-war coalition, were also anti-imperialist. I'm sorry. The question Leo asked is, what are the intersections between sort of anti-imperialist sentiments and the opposition to U.S. going to war? As I mentioned before, I mean, Irish Republican activists were very much opposed to going to war, especially after Easter Rising gets crushed. You know, you want us to support those people who just crushed our people, you know, in the post office in Dublin. But it's interesting, most of the Catholic hierarchy, which was overwhelmingly Irish, you know, stayed neutral about that because they realized they couldn't just be Irish. There are a lot of Italians and Hungarians and other Poles who had different views about the war. But one of the things the anti-war coalition tried to do, especially in New York and Chicago, and to some degree in San Francisco too, is they put together these forums, which they often called War Against War, which included independence activists from these different places. And of course, they demanded, as Wilson did later on, self-determination for the independent nations. I mean, you all know, I'm sure, that this was a war fought by empires. The British Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Prussian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and one could argue the American Empire once it got into it. And those who opposed the war from the left, which were often the people who ran the main organizations, the Women's Peace Party and the American Union Against Militarism, that was very important to them. It wasn't important to, you know, some of the Southern Democrats. It was also important to Robert La Follette. I mean, we forget that, you know, Republicans at the time, on some issues, were to the left of Democrats. On race, certainly. Well, these people like La Follette were. Often on women's suffrage as well. And also on questions of internationalism. La Follette was as left-wing a senator, I think, as we've had in America until this guy who ran for president. I forget his name. But he was a Republican, you know, until 1924 when he ran as progressive and was supported by the Socialist Party. Other questions?
We're beginning to run out of time, so we got time for one more question.
Another historian. Chris Lehman.
No, failed.
Editor of the Baffler.
No one knows what the Baffler is, but thanks.
I think as many people know what it is as know what Dissent is. So,
I've always been struck by the William James essay you quoted at the end of your talk as a moment that isolated a kind of. It issued a challenge, I think, to anti-war people and people on the left that I still feel like hasn't been fully reckoned with. And you also mentioned in your talk how, you know, it's important to distinguish the people you're talking about in your book from isolationists, and how, you know, there is an automatic stigma in mainstream conservative discourse that attaches to the anti-war left. And I think what James was doing was trying to, you know, say, look, you know, not only are we going to harness all this destructive young male energy, but we're going to, you know, infuse the left or, you know, the forces opposed to war with, you know, a grander sense of moral purpose that corresponds to what goes into the mobilization of a war. And so, you know, in contemporary debates and, you know, everything, you know, the experience of the Iraq War is very fresh in the minds of many of us. You know, we had this same dynamic play out where it turns out the anti-war critics were right, and they were vilified as, filthy hippies or whatever, forces of appeasement, who lacked moral clarity and the moral courage and all these qualities that James is talking about. So I guess my question is, how do we answer James's challenge today?
Thanks a lot for that question, Chris. I feel like I need to be a minister, I quote the Bible or something. Just, turn your swords and plowshares. I mean, no big deal. I don't know. I think, it's a problem because war, as James said, is a great, honor, solidarity, sacrificing, living for more than yourself. I mean, one of the reasons I've been involved in social movements for majority of my life is because I get some of that feeling from that. And also, the only war I think I'm absolutely certain I think the United States should have fought was World War II. Korea, I keep changing my mind about. But I think, it's got to be done clearly, not just with diplomacy. That's what people like Ernie Carnegie thought. You put all these international lawyers together, they'll have these great plans of mediation and so forth, and they're able to work it out. I think a lot of what goes on, of course, is that people go to war because their lives aren't very exciting and inspiring beyond that. And I don't want to say we have to find ways in which that can happen for majority of people, but I certainly think that nations which are more egalitarian are much less likely to go to war. That's usually true. Not always, but usually true. Scandinavian nations have not sort of pushed themselves towards war. Sometimes they got involved in war, like Norway during World War II because they got invaded. But, what can I say? It's past 6 o'clock and... Yeah, another book, not mine. I think we have to, and Michael Walzer, who unfortunately is not still a co-editor of Dissent, he had to retire, but Michael Walzer has this wonderful book called Just and Unjust Wars. Maybe in schools, at least, it's a very small thing, teachers, when they talk about war, should say, what is a just war? When is war just? Not just assume every war is just because America fights one, leave the question open, that might be a good way to start. Thank you.